Well, it's been a few years, but it's great to be back with the Wine Education Council, and today we're going to be talking about stem inclusion in winemaking. And I'm Brandon Sparks-Gillis, a vineyard owner from the Santa Barbara County area of California, and have a little bit of personal experience with this topic. As every harvest, there's always a decision-making element in terms of whether to incorporate stems or not incorporate stems. So stem inclusion is a broad topic that we think of when we're in the process of producing red wine. So one of the first decisions to make right after the harvest is whether to process the fruit and fully destem the grapes, or whether to incorporate some or all of the stems into the winemaking process. And this can be quite a wide range. In a given fermenter, for instance, you could actually go from 100% destemmed all the way to 100% whole cluster, or somewhere in between. And that decision, we'll get into that a little bit later as to why that decision is made. And we're talking about stem inclusion, it's important to talk about the rachis. So the rachis is the physical part of the plant where the berries are attached. Here I've removed the berries just to show what the rachis looks like. So to begin with, there's carbonic maceration, where whole bunches are placed into a sealed tank, which is then filled with CO2, and the fermentation is intracellular in the berry. Then there's the semi-carbonic style, where you would have whole clusters in a tank, but without the presence of CO2, where some of the clusters could naturally crush each other and the juice would remain in the vat. And finally, there could be the use of a portion of whole clusters along with a portion of destemmed fruit within the same tank. So like grapes, stems have a spectrum of ripeness, and their flavors range from unwanted green herbaceous notes to something more savory and complex as the ripeness increases. And you can see here, there's a bit of woody lignification heading into the stem, which later in the season is going to give this particular cluster good odds of having the really more beneficial flavors. So another potential benefit could be a slight reduction in alcohol. So because the stems incorporate a woody part of the plant, they absorb some of the physical wine, including some of the alcohol. And so in some cases, there are producers who report up to 1% of alcohol reduction by use of stems. So in making the consideration whether to utilize whole clusters or to fully destem fruit, it's important to fundamentally remember that stems contain tannins, and therefore, depending on the extraction process, stem inclusion will often increase the level of tannin in a wine. Yeah, in terms of the decision-making surrounding the use of whole clusters, it's important to remember that if you're using whole clusters in the fermentation, the harvest has to be by hand. Another reason why some people tend not to use stem inclusion is that the stems themselves can lower the acidity in the wine and increase the pH in the wine. And the reason for that is because the stems actually maintain potassium from the plant and can transfer that into the must, which then actually softens the acidity in a wine. So depending on where the acidity of a given vintage is and the wine pH, that might be a reason either to avoid or to include the stem inclusion. Another reason why some people might not employ stem inclusion would be the risk of microbial spoilage. So particularly in 100% stem inclusion vats, the lack of juice within a fermentation bin, which would not cover the fruit, allows for certain spoilage microorganisms, things like gluconobacter and acetobacter, to start metabolizing sugars and creating vinegar or spoilage bacteria in advance of the fermentation occurring. Another approach to stem inclusion would be to layer the fermenter. Sometimes we call this the lasagna approach, where you might put some whole clusters at the bottom, destem a layer of destemmed fruit on top, put another layer of whole clusters, follow with another destemmed. And the advantage or disadvantage of doing that really relates to the dynamic of the fermentation temperatures. So if you have whole clusters in multiple places in the fermentation, you're going to have less mixing, so perhaps a little bit less extraction, but that would actually generally lower the fermentation temperature. So that might be one reason why someone might take a layered or lasagna approach to a whole cluster fermenter. Thanks for joining us on this journey talking about stem inclusion. We've actually reached the most exciting time of the year, which is harvest. So we've just been out in the vineyard looking at whether we might incorporate stems or not, and now we're back at the winery. And that's when the real-world decision-making process comes into play. So today we're actually in the process of destemming some fruit. And so as you can see here with the destemmer in action, the destemmer removes the fruit berry by berry from the stem. And so here we have pure fruit, purely destemmed fruit falling into a fermenter. And the way the destemmer works is the purely destemmed fruit comes straight down into the fermentation bin, and the stems get shot out the back into another bin where we take them to compost. And in the real world, as we're processing fruit at the winery, there are times where smelling that rachis bin, that stem bin coming off the destemmer, could actually inform our decision as to whether to confirm our decision to continue destemming or whether we would stop and incorporate some whole clusters. So sometimes the smells coming off of the rachis bin are incredibly herbaceous, sometimes even to the point of being bitter and jalapeno and very, very aggressive, while at other times we'll walk by the stem bins and we'll smell a gorgeous perfume, a little bit of forest floor, maybe even a little bit of truffle, savory spice, in which case we might stop the destemming process, go back and actually incorporate some whole clusters into the fermentation. On behalf of the Wine Education Council, thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you soon.